Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the next installment of the Fall 2021 Virtual Book Talk series, sponsored by the Program in the History of the Book in American Culture here at the American Antiquarian Society. We come to you today from the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, a community that continues to thrive here in central Massachusetts. I'm Kevin Wisniewski, Director of Book History here at AAS, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here today. As always, with me is AAS Library Assistant Amanda Kondek. Today's guest is Mark Rifkin, who in a few moments will share a presentation on his new book, Speaking for the People, Native Writing and the Question of Political Form, published by Duke University Press earlier this year. Before introducing today's guest, I would like to briefly introduce the Society to newcomers. AAS was founded in 1812 by printer Isaiah Thomas. We are a research library and learned society located in Worcester, Massachusetts. We're devoted to understanding and sharing the history and culture of North America before the 20th century. As a library, we collect, preserve, and share the printed record of what is now the United States, portions of Canada, and the Caribbean. Our collections include books and pamphlets, newspapers and periodicals, manuscripts, and the graphic arts. In addition to these virtual book talk series, we have a variety of public programs. We offer visiting research fellowships, and we welcome scholars and readers from around the world to use our reading room to work on their own research projects. Now, I would like to turn things over to Amanda, who will offer a quick overview on the platform we're using today. Amanda.
Thank you, Kevin, and welcome everyone. Before we get started, I have just a few quick notes on the format of our Zoom webinar. The chat function is open, so please send your comments to everyone. And throughout the presentation, I'll also be posting additional information and links in the chat relating to AAS, feedback, and our speaker. And you should be able to save the chat by clicking on the three dots in the chat window. If you have any problems with your visual or audio settings, you can also message me privately in the chat. For the Q&A portion of the program, we'll be using the Q&A function, which is located on the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you have any questions for our speaker during or after their presentation, please type them in there. And as attendees, you'll also have the option to upvote your favorite questions by clicking the thumbs up icon. And we will answer these questions at the end of our program. Closed captioning is also available as an option for this program via Zoom's live transcription function. You can turn the closed captioning on and off with the button labeled CC. And finally, I would like to let everyone know we are recording this program and we'll put it on our website and YouTube channel. So thank you, Kevin, and back to you.
Great, thank you, thank you very much, Amanda. And now onto our program. Mark Rifkin is Linda Arnold Carlisle Distinguished Excellence Professor of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and Professor of English at UNC Greensboro. In addition to Speaking for the People, which he's going to talk about in a moment, he's the author of 6 books, including Fictions of Land and Flesh, Blackness, Indigeneity, Speculation, from Duke University Press 2019, and also from Duke University Press in 2017, Beyond Settler Time, Temporal Sovereignty and Indigenous Self-Determination. Other books include The Erotics of Sovereignty, Queer Native Writing in the Era of Self-Determination from the University of Minnesota Press in 2012, and When Did Indians Become Straight? Kinship and the History of Sexuality and Native Sovereignty from Oxford University Press, which won the John Hope Franklin Prize for Best Book in American Studies. He has also co-edited the award-winning Sexuality, Nationality, Indigeneity, a special double issue in the journal GLQ, Journal of Lesbian and Gay Studies. And he has served as a president of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association. So with that, I welcome Mark Rifkin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kevin, and thank you to the American Antiquarian Society for inviting me to present today. I'm coming to you from Tuscarora, Occaneechi, and Saponi lands, and thank you so much to everyone for making time in your day to come listen to this talk. So I'll just jump right in. In 1978, the Bureau of Indian Affairs developed official criteria and an evaluative process for recognizing Native peoples who currently were not officially acknowledged as such for federal purposes. The guidelines have changed over the years, having been updated most recently in 2015, but a number of elements of the process persist across these alterations, including the need to prove descent from a, quote, historical Indian tribe, end quote, existence as an Indian entity, the possession of a distinct community, and the presence of consistent, quote, political influence or authority, end quote, over members. Despite changes in the kinds of evidence used to meet these qualifications, they continue to point toward the need to signify Indianness as a discrete kind of bounded difference in order to become legible as an Indigenous people within the legal and administrative networks of settler governance. The presumptive form of such Indigenous collectivity entails having a group of persons who belong exclusively to it, rather than having multiple relations with various Indian entities, a clearly delimited land base to which they have more or less exclusive claim, and a system of governance that has jurisdiction-like extension over this outlined group and place. We might describe this model as the political form of the Indian tribe. As Joanne Barker notes, in federal Indian law and policy, quote, the recognition of Native status and rights is really about the coercion of Native peoples to recognize themselves to be under federal power within federal terms, end quote. Presenting one's people as organized in ways consistent with the political form of the Indian tribe, though, provides the condition of possibility not only for accessing particular legal and material resources, such as having territory put in what's called trust by the federal government and made officially governable under tribal law, but also for being able to speak and advocate for that collectivity in relation to institutional networks for whom that form, the Indian tribe, provides the organizing template for entree. In this way, the recognition process highlights the intimate imbrication of political form, collective voice or speech, and institutional intelligibility. To seek recognition by settler institutions and publics entails offering a portrait of peoplehood that licenses representative speech in the name of that collectivity. Serving as a political spokesperson requires that one speak in ways that can be heard as representative, as indexing a coherent collective entity, and doing so in ways that appear to be expressive of that public's sentiments, wants, and needs. 19th century Native writing by intellectuals from peoples on lands claimed by the US offers numerous examples of just such a claim, to be speaking in the name of a particular people in order to pursue recognition of one kind or another. Unlike in the case of the pursuit of federal acknowledgement, though, such texts are neither acts of governance per se, undertaken by constituted authorities operating in their publicly authorized capacities, nor are they direct engagements with US officials. Rather, these authors present themselves in their accounts as representative in order to engage with settler publics, often seeking to mobilize those publics to call for changes in existing Indian policy. In doing so, though, such texts need to negotiate non-native expectations about what can count as Indigenous peoplehood, including by what process the authors can appear as proper spokespersons who can convey collective dispositions, grievances, and desires. Looking back to these earlier 19th century authors, the context out of which their writings emerged, and the aims and implications of the strategies they employed opens possibilities for developing more textured ways of talking about the politics of peoplehood. In their efforts to mediate settler frameworks, writings by 19th century Native authors draw attention to the intellectual labor entailed in navigating, inhabiting, and seeking to reorganize non-native networks. Attending to that work of negotiating with settler forms highlights the broader question of how Indigenous modes of peoplehood are shaped and reshaped in their interface with settler ideological and institutional formations. This set of issues lies at the heart of existing scholarly discussions around and critiques of recognition. And while in this talk I won't be discussing those particular scholarly lines of analysis, I'd be happy to talk more about the Indigenous studies critique of recognition and this project's relation to it in the question and answer section. I argue that these 19th century texts' efforts to secure non-native recognition of Indigenous modes of peoplehood, governance, and territoriality illustrate the force and contingency of settler frameworks, as well as the struggles involved in narrating Indigenous collectivity under ongoing colonial occupation. In claiming an ability to represent Native peoplehood, to speak about by speaking for, the writers I discuss all offer portraits of what peoplehood is, and across the book, I discuss Elias Boudinot, William Apess, Sarah Winnemucca, and Zitkala-Ša, and in a few moments, I'll turn to a more extended reading of Sarah Winnemucca's Life Among the Paiutes as a way of illustrating some of these broader points. So the writers I discuss all offer portraits of what peoplehood is. In doing so, they make choices among a range of potentially disparate, even incommensurate, ways of envisioning indigeneity and Indigenous governance. The choices about how to do so are affected by available non-native ways of understanding Indianness, tribal identity, and what constitutes a political claim. Authors mobilize such frameworks in order to gain access to and participate as intelligible speakers and claimants within what can be characterized as settler networks. The ways these writers stage the legitimacy of their own speech within such settler networks affects how indigeneity will appear within their texts, even as the texts themselves seek to redirect the framework they employ to Indigenous ends. Such texts demonstrate the negotiatedness of Native political form as it circulates in settler networks, official and popular. These writings then also draw attention to broader questions with regard to how to understand choices of political form and the orienting context in which such choices occur, a set of practical, philosophical, and ethical concerns which arise not solely in direct print engagements with non-native publics, but also within the extra-textual dynamics of Indigenous governance. So the kinds of negotiations that I'm talking about with regard to native texts when they're speaking to non-native publics, similar kinds of negotiations, not the same, but similar kinds of negotiations are happening sort of on the ground, as it were, in working through what Indigenous governance itself will look like. My analysis of how 19th century Native texts sought to stage their own representativity aims to open additional avenues for thinking about how conceptions and experiences of collective identity, voice, and self-determination continually emerge through ongoing processes in which the form of peoplehood remains an open-ended question and negotiation. The de facto legal referent for sovereignty lies in a conception of Indigenous governance as centralized and operative over a clearly bounded territory with an easily defined determinate population, again, the form of the Indian tribe. Looking at the varied historical and geopolitical dynamics across the 19th century that shape authors' work, though, underlines that Indigenous political form does not have an archetypical outline, instead taking shape with regard to the particularities of disparate Native peoples' geographies, philosophies, relations with other peoples, and dense entanglements within the colonial frameworks of those who seek to occupy Indigenous lands and to extend authority over Native peoples and territories. What's at stake, though, when a particular model of peoplehood analytically functions as the Indigenous real? Such de facto assessment can be seen in the ways Native texts, requests, and demands for recognition and their mobilization of particular kinds of political form in doing so, critically can be viewed as wanting in two different ways. They can be seen as failing due to their difference from what is taken to be the basis for the governance of the people in question at the time the text was written and published. So something like, here's what the actual political structure of this people was during that period, as opposed to the representation offered in a given text. Or such texts can be seen as wanting by scholars due to the ways another account of sovereignty is taken to be unimplicated in colonial relations, envisioned as less compromised than the version of political form offered by a given writer. So something like, here's how Native people or peoples actually are when they're not trying to accommodate non-natives. In that interpretive mode, a particular textual account of peoplehood, a particular employment of political form, is understood to succeed or fail to the extent that it can be seen as mimetic of a given extra-textual political formation, itself taken as expressive of the real, colonially uncontaminated, version of Indigenous self-understanding. This way of reading, or more broadly, this way of approaching what constitutes indigeneity, can end up measuring representations of peoplehood in relation to a presumptive Indigenous real that lies elsewhere, such that Native writings or other articulations of sovereignty and peoplehood are positioned as properly bearing that real. They are seen as either sovereignty enacting acts of affirmation or expressions of a kind of false colonially contaminated consciousness. What I'm pointing to is the dangers and limits of critical work that implicitly draws on a notion of political authenticity against which other formulations of indigeneity come to be delegitimized as less truly indigenous. Such a framing can posit a somewhat idealized normative model of indigeneity as the standard, elevating one version of a people's governance in a given period in ways that erase extant alternatives, as well as the tensions among them and the processes and philosophies at play in navigating those tensions. By contrast, through a turn to the modes and circumstances of articulation for 19th century writing, I seek to highlight the texture, difficulties, and labor of negotiations over political form within situated circumstances of ongoing colonialism. In order to further develop these points and provide a case study for these dynamics, I will turn to Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins's Life Among the Paiutes, published in 1883. The text offers a searing account of the violences of the reservation system and its effects on the lives, territories, and governance of Northern Paiutes from the 1860s to the early 1880s. In mounting this critique, the narrative positions Winnemucca as a spokesperson for the Paiute people, due to her chiefly lineage, while insisting on the civilized character of the Paiutes in their distinction from other neighboring peoples. However, in the middle of the period covered by Winnemucca's narrative, the ghost dance of 1870 arises out of visions by Wadziwab, a northern Paiute prophet living on the Walker River Reservation. And despite the ghost dance's prominence throughout the region, it, as well as other prominent prophet movements, is nowhere addressed in Winnemucca's narrative. Reading Life Among the Paiutes in terms of the ghost dance highlights the text's struggle to coalesce a representative, civilized subjectivity through which to signify cohesive Paiute political identity, while reciprocally underlining how that picture of Paiute peoplehood, of the Paiutes as a coherent Indian tribe, works to displace the alternative possibilities enacted through the geopolitics of ghost dancing. Many scholars have noted that Winnemucca draws on forms of presentation that would be familiar to white readers in order to advocate for the Paiute people. But what precisely is the entity in whose name or in whose stead Winnemucca is said to speak? Winnemucca's text seeks to ameliorate the violence of the colonial context of the late 19th century reservation system by drawing on the terms of Indian policy in order to offer a version of Paiute collectivity for which she can advocate with non-native publics and government officials. And I should note that Winnemucca's text is written and published in the wake of the Bannock War, which I can say more about during the question and answer period, in which a number of Paiutes participated. And as a result of the Bannock War, then a number of Paiutes, those who were participated, but also a number of non-combatants, were removed from where they had been in the vicinity of the Malheur Reservation to the Yakima Reservation, which was hundreds of miles away. So part of what Winnemucca is advocating for is the return of those Paiutes from the Yakima Reservation, the return from exile on the Yakima Reservation to their previous residence. But if one does not assume the existence of a singular political body for which Winnemucca speaks, though, her speech can be understood as actively working to generate a sense of cohesive Northern Paiute nationhood. Winnemucca's narrative cites and circulates extant discourses of representativity in ways that draw on the forms of Indigenous collectivity, governance, and territoriality already at play in Indian policy, such as having a singular leadership on a clearly delineated land base that is cleanly differentiated from that of other tribes. Life among the Paiutes helps generate a sense of overarching Paiute peoplehood, of Paiutes' identity as a tribe, and Winnemucca's claims to speak for this group. That impression of Winnemucca's representativity enables the text to do particular kinds of public and political work. The question then is less, does Winnemucca truly speak for the Paiute people? Then how does she convey a sense of such peoplehood through rhetorically constructing her own ability to speak as a representative in that people's name? And what is at stake in such a construction? Furthermore, what other forms of Indigenous peoplehood present in the late 19th century in the Great Basin lie outside the bounds of such dynamics of civilized representativity? And what is gained intellectually, critically, in pointing to this tension or the displacement of those other political forms? From the beginning, life among the Paiutes situates Winnemucca within a line of leaderly succession that licenses her speech as a representative for the Paiute people. In the first paragraph of the narrative, she indicates, quote, "My grandfather was a chief of the entire Paiute nation," end quote. And when her grandfather, Truckee, a name given to him by whites, returns from having fought in the Mexican-American War in California on the side of the US, he, quote, "told my father to take charge of his people and hold the tribe," end quote, while Truckee returned to California with about 30 families to work for what he called his white brothers. And Winnemucca continues, quote, "My father took his place as chief of the Paiutes and had it as long as he lived," end quote. Later in the narrative, when Truckee is on his deathbed, quote, "he looked at my father and told him what he must do, as he was to be head chief of the Paiute nation," end quote. These moments unequivocally present the Paiutes as an integrated political body under a single leader, and they cast that authority as generationally transmitted, such that Winnemucca occupies a privileged position in communicating Paiute interests and aims to non-natives. She appears to readers as, in her own terms, quote, "the chieftain's weary daughter," end quote. In presenting herself as part of the ruling family, Winnemucca invokes a geopolitical entity over which their authority is extended, the Paiute nation, that supposedly encompasses large swaths of territory in the Great Basin. Quite early in the narrative, she notes, quote, "My people were scattered at that time over nearly all the territory now known as Nevada," end quote. Winnemucca, though, does not discuss any coming together of widely separated Paiutes as a body or a meeting by representatives from groups whose principal dwellings lie far from each other. What appears here to tie them together as a people is their mutual affiliation to Chief Winnemucca, Sarah Winnemucca's father. The narrative repeatedly speaks as if there were an underlying entity for which his chiefdom is the expression. The territory used by these groups that Winnemucca is gesturing toward extended approximately 78,000 square miles, and there were over 20 Northern Paiute bands. While distinguished by the particular lands and waters they claimed as their own, the bands did not so much operate as cohesive, discrete geopolitical units as occupy overlapping spheres of use in which each band recognized the other's right to control particular areas, even as they regularly sought and were given permission to use them as part of subsistence strategies within shifting Great Basin ecologies. Michael Allen Gualtieri suggests that, quote, these family or household groups were affiliated via a complex web of intersecting consanguineal and affinal relationships, cooperative foraging relationships, and relationships linking particular population clusters at particular times to transcendental power, or puha, itself, end quote. People throughout the Great Basin developed extensive relations of kinship and trade with each other that allowed individuals and families to draw on resources in a range of spaces that were not associated with the band to which they may have belonged. There is debate then over whether something like the idea of chief makes sense for talking about Northern Paiute groups and modes of authority prior to the mid to late 19th century. More than indicating her father's prominence among the Paiutes as their undisputed chief, though, Winnemucca's text repeatedly illustrates how US officials, civilian and military, treat her father as the preeminent leader of the Paiutes, as a singular polity. The narrative repeatedly provides examples of settler officials insisting on the importance of bringing Chief Winnemucca back to state-managed spaces, reservations and army bases, when he is refused to stay within their boundaries. Such officials seek to draw on Chief Winnemucca in order to generate a sense of coherent Paiute identity over which US authority can be exercised through him. Reciprocally, Winnemucca cites the Indian services and the Army's use of her father to these ends in ways that reaffirm his role as head chief of the Paiute nation, and thus her own legitimacy as the advocate for the Paiute people, as their representative in interactions with non-native publics, such as in the writing of Life Among the Paiutes. The narrative draws on the administrative and popular narrative of Chief Winnemucca's ubiquitous authority across Paiute space in order to position the text as a mode of diplomatic engagement. In this way, we might characterize Life Among the Paiutes as enacting a treaty imaginary, conveying the sense that Winnemucca's writing itself surrogates for the absent scene of formal negotiation. US treaty making with Native peoples officially ends by congressional act in 1871, and the Northern Paiutes did not have any formal treaties with the federal government. However, Winnemucca seeks to generate the sense of a treaty relationship, with her family serving as diplomatic mediators. In the narrative, she references a, quote, treaty giving the Pyramid Lake Reservation to my people, end quote. And in her speeches and engagements before the publication of the narrative, Winnemucca spoke widely, both on the East Coast, but then also prior to that in Nevada, in California, long before the publication of the narrative. And in her speeches and engagements, she speaks of the Pyramid Lake and Malheur reservations as resulting from treaties. Although inaccurate, as both reservations were created by presidential executive orders, invoking a legacy of treaty making and treaty violation, or at least one of Paiute signing documents whose terms are deceptive in ways that gesture toward histories of treaty manipulation by the US, allows Winnemucca to position her narrative as an effort to engage in a good faith process of negotiation. Moreover, in the narrative, she describes the request to travel to Washington, D.C. that she, her father, and her brother received from a US official in the wake of the Bannock War. In her discussion of their time in the US Capitol, Winnemucca indicates that when meeting with various officials, she and those with her advocated for the return of the non-combatant Paiutes who had been removed to the Yakima Reservation. This part of the narrative underlines her and her family's role as officially recognized representatives authorized to speak for the Paiutes. Life Among the Paiutes works to convey the sense of Winnemucca as someone authorized on both sides to serve as a mediator between Paiutes and the US government, seeking to give a diplomatic cast and force to the proposals offered in the text for addressing the settler-orchestrated expulsions and deprivations experienced by Paiute people. However, the character, contours, and geographies of indigeneity at work in prophet movements and associated spiritual practices differ greatly from the centralization of political authority and reification of tribal identities and boundaries at play in US Indian policy, particularly the reservation system. The most famous and well-documented such movements in the late 19th century, the ghost dances of 1870 and 1890, as they have come to be known, can be understood less in terms of particular sets of ideologies or principles that derive from a single prophet figure than as part and parcel of a broader set of socio-spiritual dynamics that were prevalent throughout the region during the entire period. As Gregory Smoke suggests, quote, "The ghost dances were an appeal to spiritual power to overturn a world that was not of their making," end quote. Smoke continues, quote, "The ghost dances were not two discrete movements, but rather two periods of intense excitement in a continuing pattern of religious practice that stretched throughout the 19th century and survives to this day," end quote. As these prophet movements took shape in the Great Basin and adjacent areas in the last decades of the century, they contested the geographies of the reservation system, challenged the demarcation of tribal entities in US administrative mappings, and bypassed the kinds of political leadership on which federal Indian policy relied, such as in the turn to Chief Winnemucca as the head chief of the Paiute Nation. Even as Winnemucca's narrative seeks to project a sense of encompassing Paiute political cohesion through the depiction of her family's leadership, the text registers other kinds of prophecy-based and prophecy-adjacent authority at play in the Great Basin, which suggest a very different kind of mapping than that of a head chief who can represent a unified nation. These include the multiple references in the narrative to prophetic dreams by members of Winnemucca's family. The ability to prophesy in this way or to receive information about what's occurring elsewhere through visions seems to reinforce the Winnemucca family's suitability for leadership by suggesting that their authority arises from other than human sanction. Dreaming, though, served more broadly as the basis for shamanic power among Native peoples across the Great Basin, indicating a spirit entity's endowment of greater than ordinary access to puha, the omnipresent forms of energy available in all living things. To be possessed of such increased abilities enabled one to mobilize ambient forms of power to particular ends, especially forms of healing, thereby leading to the figure of the medicine man. As Gregory Smoke argues, popular belief, quote, in the efficacy of shamanism throughout the region provided the internal logic of the prophetic religions of the 19th century, including both ghost dances, end quote. The emergence of prophet-led movements that involved thousands of people and spread across the Great Basin and Columbia Plateau, extending at different points into California and onto the plains, testifies to the continuing importance among the Paiutes and neighboring peoples of puha and those who can wield it. In addition to referencing the Winnemucca family's dreamings, the text also implicitly gestures to the importance of puha in securing chiefly status for Chief Winnemucca. Winnemucca notes, quote, "My people capture antelopes by charming them, but only some of the people are charmers. My father was one of them, and once I went with him on an antelope hunt," end quote. Since antelopes were a major source of subsistence and charming them was understood as a principal way of gathering enough of them to sustain a band or set of bands for the year, having access to an antelope charmer was of great importance as part of annual food strategies, and being such a charmer granted someone considerable authority within and among bands. Bands, as well as sustained relations among them, could take shape around these figures and the forms of power that they employed. Moreover, the rituals surrounding the antelope hunt also involved a round dance, which throughout the Great Basin served as a means of collectively gathering and enacting puha in various annual traditions. And such dances provided the framework for what would become the central ritual enactment, circle dancing, from which the ghost dance received its name. So even as Winnemucca is presenting her father's sort of shamanic capabilities is illustrating his ability to be chief of the Paiute nation. She's also implicitly drawing on a much wider presence of puha and shamanic power that's far more widely distributed, right, in the Great Basin, and that gives rise to, or is in relation to, these prophetic movements which do not fit into the picture of centralized tribal authority that Winnemucca's narrative keeps offering. With respect to Oitz, one of the leaders at the Malheur Reservation, Winnemucca casts him as a disruptive influence, while also providing tidbits of information that instead suggest he is imbued with shamanic power. Life Among the Paiutes reports that Winnemucca's father and Egan, another leader on the reservation, indicated to Agent Samuel Parrish as evidence that Oitz, quote, is a very bad man. They say, quote, our good father, we are afraid of Oitz because he says he can make us all die here. Last winter, we had some kind of sickness and a great many of our children died. He said it was he who was making us sick, end quote. At another point, in an effort to heal a Paiute child whom Reinhardt, another Indian agent, had assaulted, Oitz, quote, was laying hands, end quote, on the boy, echoing the text's earlier description of treatment by Paiute doctors, quote, our medicine man cures the sick by laying on of hands, end quote. These moments point to Oitz's ability to draw on puha, or alternately as a shaman to heal and as a witch to injure. These instances direct attention to the challenge that he poses to the agent's control over the reservation, including his initial refusal to labor and Oitz's ongoing relationships with what are called the Columbia River Indians. That group, the Columbia River Indians, are designated as quote unquote bad Indians due to their refusal to stay within reservation boundaries and their continuance of older regional trade patterns. While somewhat loose in its field of reference, the phrase Columbia River Indians repeatedly is used in official US reports to refer to the band led by Smohala. Smohala was a mid-19th century leader of Wanapum descent who had prophetic visions, eventually gathering a group of followers who at the height of his influence numbered in thousands, mainly living with him in an off-reservation area just south of the Columbia River. Like Wadziwab, Smohala called for a return to older ways and a renunciation of white technologies and practices. Accounts of Oitz at the time routinely characterized him as a dreamer, meaning that he specifically was linked to the followers of Smohala and to the dissemination of the ghost dance more broadly. The text's depiction of Oitz, as well as of Chief Winnemucca then, raises the issue of the role of puha in Paiute sociopolitical formations, modes of leadership, and participation in networks sustained through prophecy, while the text offers a significantly truncated account of those aspects of Paiute life. The narrative mobilizes the story of the political status of Winnemucca's family in ways that enable Winnemucca and the text itself to appear as representative, as embodying the collective will of the Paiute people. In doing so, though, the text includes other formations of leadership and identification at play in the region throughout the time period it covers. The powerful influence of forms of shamanic power and prophecy and the wide-ranging movements to which the latter especially gave rise appear fleetingly in the text. Attending to such ghost dance geographies, though, helps bring to the fore both the constructedness, administrative and textual, of accounts of unified Paiute nationality and the presence of other forms of peoplehood. The production of Paiute as a coherent tribal identity in this way entails separating the Paiute nation from the Columbia River Indians, as discussed earlier, as well as the Bannocks. These differentiations from those who in the text are labeled bad Indians work to cast Winnemucca's people as a separate entity undeserving of the forms of state-sanctioned mismanagement and dispossession they face. Moreover, if one reads through the administrative records of Indian policy at the time, including reports from Indian agents in the region, one can see that both the Columbia River Indians and Bannocks, those terms, are used as if they referred to particular peoples, But instead, those terms largely serve as placeholders to discuss a range of groups variously composed that refuse to live on reservation or to submit to US authority. Thus, other potentials for Native collective self-understanding and modes of diplomatic, spiritual, and territorial relation need to be effaced if the Paiute nation is to emerge as a coherent object of public policy and advocacy within the terms of extant Indian administration. There is a relative absence of discussion of regular shamanic and spiritually motivated activity in Winnemucca's narrative, a gap underlined by the fact that the text jumps from 1868 to 1875, skipping over the period of greatest attention to Wadziwab's visions, again commonly known as the Ghost Dance of 1870. This evasion by the text can be understood as an effort to bypass the kinds of authority generated through such practices in favor of a portrait of Paiute collectivity as organized in ways more amenable to Euro-American political forms. Attending to the presence of ghost dances, though, allows one to appreciate the ways the account of Paiute peoplehood developed within the text relies on disavowing the social dynamics surrounding and generated by these prophetic movements. Put another way, the text can be read as bending around the eventness of the Ghost Dance of 1870 and similar prophetic movements in its effort to provide a particular vision or version of Paiute peoplehood. Winnemucca's narrative not only is marked by the strain of doing so, it seeks to implot Paiute history and identity in ways that transform ghost dancing into a non-event, something that does not figure in the ongoing emergence of Paiute national history, as it is characterized from within the terms of federal Indian policy. Critically foregrounding the presence of ghost dances and the forms of collective identification that they generated and on which they relied, though, brings into relief the textual strategies through which Winnemucca seeks to generate a sense of the Paiute nation, in whose name she can speak and advocate when maneuvering through official discourses of Indianness and the extant terms of settler governance. So speaking for the people illustrates how the conditions of settler colonial rule affect how Native intellectuals articulate and employ political form in their writings. Their writings inhabit, challenge, and refunction non-Native discourses in ways that facilitate engagement and advocacy with settler publics. But reciprocally, such frameworks also then orient the accounts of Indigenous peoplehood offered in their texts. Exploring the potential disjunctions between their accounts and extant Indigenous geopolitical formations, though, is less in the interest of underlining the authenticity of the latter against the former than of highlighting the dynamics and politics of mediation. What does inhabiting settler-sanctioned or settler-intelligible political forms do, in particular historical and political conjunctures? Conversely, how might we understand the possibilities offered by the use of such forms as also having costs? Such costs and erasures also point back toward the dynamics of force that permeate what Jean Dennison has called colonial entanglements, drawing attention to the intellectual labor of figuring out how productively to engage such colonial force and the ethical complexities and densities of that engagement. While my analysis is focused on 19th century Native authors, I want to suggest that such scenes of writing and representation provide ways of approaching the broader question of how to conceptualize engagement with settler forms and frames of reference at all levels, and how to understand decisions about the shape of Indigenous governance and the flourishing of Native peoples as matters of ongoing deliberation, discussion, and debate, as processes rather than ready solutions that can be derived from a set of foundational first principles, principles on which all the people who comprise the people might not agree. Thinking about peoplehood and Indigenous governance as a matter of form opens possibilities for addressing the multiplicity of ways of framing sovereignty, placemaking, and belonging, and the multidimensional dynamics of grappling with those differences. Foregrounding the ways particular texts speak to such continuing tensions, unresolved issues, and the struggles involved in shaping and reshaping peoplehood positions Native literatures, past and present, as a vital resource for texturing accounts of Indigenous political imagination, including highlighting the complex negotiations that are the politics of peoplehood. That project of reading turns away from looking for the singular real that supposedly can ground analysis and toward a perhaps more sustained grappling with the open-ended unfinishedness of self-determination, especially under conditions of ongoing occupation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Mark. Wonderful. As a reminder to folks that are in attendance, the Q&A is open, and you can submit your questions there now. Mark, while we are waiting for folks to do so, I'd love to just kind of jump right in and ask a few myself. First, you frame these 4 authors' works in your introduction as intermediaries between respective Indigenous peoples. I'm kind of breaking down 3 perspective groups, maybe 4. The respective Indigenous peoples, and we could break that down further by, I think, separating out tribal leaders or elites. The second group being US government officials, and then the third being this popular white settler belief or mythology. Could you discuss a little bit about readership and the reception of some of the works that you examine in the book? So how did audiences respond to Winnemucca's life? And if you'd like to open up that a bit further and talk about Elias Boudinot's letters and et cetera, I'd be happy to hear how different audiences responded to these works. Oh, and you're on mute now, I'm sorry.
Sorry. In response to what you were asking, one thing that I want to tweak a little, though, is I describe them as mediators and engaging in mediation as opposed to being intermediaries. And the reason I mark that distinction is in the longer book, I draw on the work of Bruno Latour in talking about how networks function, and what he marks a difference between intermediaries where they simply there's no change that occurs in the movement of information, of messages, of texts, of forms, right? As opposed to a mediator, right? In which the connection, right, between, let's say, an author, or a particular question and an institution, right, that the addressing it, right, does not simply carry forward a set meaning, right, but transforms it, right? So that it's, rather than thinking about these texts as simply taking up forms available in Indian policy or assumptions of non-natives, and that those forms are unchanged in the taking them up. I want to think about what happens when Native writers are mediating, right, their forms. And that also is a way of thinking about how forms are always engaged in a process of mediation, even the forms of governance kind of on the ground, right, as it were, rather than the idea that there is a sort of set structure to Indigenous governance, and we can kind of measure these texts against it, or even that we can think about Indigenous governance as static, kind of in the way, instead of thinking about how Native peoples are themselves making decisions and negotiating and debating about what form governance will take, and the choice of a form, right, is meaningful, contested, right, and those forms do different things in different contexts, right? So again, just want to sort of underline the difference between sort of mediation and intermediary there. But to address your more substantive question, that the project is in many ways profoundly uninterested in what non-native readers actually did with these texts, right? So certainly they were speaking to a wide range, right, of readers. So as I was mentioned during the talk, Sarah Winnemucca, in the years before, a couple of years before, Life Among the Paiutes was written and published, and even and also in its wake, she was touring up and down the East Coast and gave literally hundreds of lectures. And if you compare the material in Life Among the Paiutes to newspaper accounts of the lectures that she gave prior to coming to the East in the early 1880s, when sort of in Nevada and California, but also the newspaper accounts of her lectures in the East, Life Among the Paiutes is basically made out of those lectures. It's essentially combined, right, sort of out of those lectures. So Life Among the Paiutes is less a sort of separate entity, right, that is meant to kind of exist on its own, than it is a part of those lectures. And she was selling it as part of those lectures. That the text itself had a petition to Congress, right, which was also circulated in the lectures, so that this was part and parcel of a wider kind of public interface, right, for her. Where someone like Elias Boudinot, when he's writing his letters attempting to justify his participation in the Treaty of New Echota. So the Treaty of New Echota was signed in 1836, and no, sorry, 1835. It was ratified in 1836, and it was signed by less than 100, right, Cherokees. After the Cherokee National Government had actually refused it multiple, right, times, and the principal group signing the Treaty of New Echota, which was known as the Treaty Party, which Elias Boudinot was involved in, had several years prior also sent competing negotiating teams to Washington that were engaged with the federal government at the same time as one sent by the Cherokee National Government. So his attempt to explain his participation, right, in the Treaty of New Echota and the work of the Treaty Party, this was entirely, right, directed, right, toward non-natives in ways, and as I write about in the book, in ways that present the Cherokee people, right, as really too ignorant to know any better in terms of opposing a treaty of removal. So my argument is not that then all of these, right, texts can be understood as sort of equally desirable formulations, right, of peoplehood. And Kevin, as you were noting, that one thing to think about, particularly with respect to 19th century writings, is the question of the ways that we might think about writers as being part of an elite, right? The question of who has access to literacy in English, who has access to publication in English, what kind of class interests are there. And we can think about class in any number of ways, in terms of wealth, in terms of a relationship to settler institutions, in terms of relative privilege, with regard to other members, right, of the tribe, but the ways that access to public speech to non-native publics, right, is not evenly, right, distributed. And that's something that we do have to consider when analyzing, right, these texts. But that does not necessarily mean that then their formulations of peoplehood need to be seen as inherently suspect, right, or as merely sort of inauthentic performances for a non-native public that can be distinguished from a sort of real, true, authentic, uncontested, uncontaminated, right, sense of sovereignty and governance kind of on the ground.
Great, thank you. We do have a question in from the audience here from Allison. I'm just going to read this off to you. You mentioned talking about the Indigenous studies critique of non-native recognition. Also a question I had for you. Considering what you've said about there being a lack of discussion about the shamanic and indigenous spirituality, would you be able to speak to Sarah Winnemucca's connection to the transcendentalist movement via the Peabody sisters as a way to further address her awareness or understanding of a non-native audience or its recognition in relation to her writing?
Well, I mean, to what extent she was sort of aware of transcendentalism through her relationship with the Peabody sisters, who were her kind of sponsors, right, in East Coast intellectual life, who kind of helped in promoting, right, her public speaking, even though, as a number of scholars have made the point, they did not, the Peabody sisters did not introduce Winnemucca to public speaking. She had a long history of doing so before, including her speeches being covered in things like the New York Times prior to, right, meeting the Peabody sisters. To what extent Winnemucca would have been familiar with transcendentalism from them, I don't know, but certainly that Winnemucca is communicating with non-native publics on the East Coast well beyond a sort of Boston elite, right, or the sort of Boston intellectual scene where transcendentalism would have been kind of predominant. And if Winnemucca did sort of learn something of transcendentalism from being, in relation to the sort of, post-Civil War Boston intellectual, right, scene through the Peabody sisters, I don't think that really shows up, right, in the narrative. I think that Winnemucca herself had, as a historical person, right, had no interest in the ghost dance, right, had no interest in taking part, right, in the ghost dance. And so we might understand the absence of the discussion of ghost dancing as expressive of her own personal dislike for it, disdain for it. But I think that it also is notable that if one traces out the kinds of geographic, political, dynamics attached to ghost dancing, right, and the fact that, if you follow those prophetic movements, you can see, right, folks moving around a great deal in the Great Basin. It does not follow the model of clearly delineated, tribal, right, entities. Attending to the ghost dance and those prophetic movements underlines the utter failure of that model to speak to actual social dynamics, right, in the Great Basin, and especially the ways that something like ghost dancing did not emerge out of whole cloth, but was an extension of existing patterns of prophecy and social dynamics and geographies, right, in the region. I think that to engage with that, with those geographies, would make impossible something like the account of a clear Paiute nation, a clear leadership for the Paiute Nation, which seems central, as I'm arguing, to Sarah Winnemucca's representation of her own authority to speak, right, of her voice as representative in order to advocate for the Paiutes. So even if she became aware of transcendentalism, even if that in some way resonated, right, with, understandings of Puha from the Great Basin, I think that the text would be, and her public presentation would be deeply invested in bracketing all of that in order to consolidate her ability to serve as a spokesperson, right, to advocate for the return to the Malheur Reservation, the recognition of Paiute land rights in reservations, compensation, right, for the losses during the Bannock War, et cetera.
Terrific. We have a follow-up that kind of goes hand in hand with that. A little less about the book, I think, but directly about this comment. What impact did the two white lieutenants, Edward Bartlett and Lewis Hopkins, who were her husbands, have, if any, on her writing, their style, and in getting them published? Or was that on Elizabeth Peabody?
I mean, I think that in terms of publication, it would be the Peabodys. Right. I mean, I think my sense, right, and the folks who have done more extensive historical work on Winnemucca's biography would probably have a better sense of this than I would. But my sense is that her husbands were more or less kind of there, right, and there wasn't a huge impact on sort of what she was doing or where she was going or how she was presenting herself, because again, what you see in Life Among the Paiutes, if you look at the newspaper accounts of what she was saying for years, right, there's consistency in those representations of her speeches, right? So when journalists are talking about what she's saying, right? That and these are Carolyn Sricio and Carrie Carpenter, right? Have a great volume of newspaper accounts related to Winnemucca's, right? Public, her public engagements, right? And that's what I'm drawing on, that wonderful work that they've done. But you can see a consistency in what she's saying over the years. There's not a whole lot of transformation. And Life Among the Paiutes really is a collection of her speeches, right? And again, if you look at those newspaper accounts, you can draw direct lines between, this is what she's been talking about. This is her talk on, domestic and social moralities. This is her talk on this. This is her talk on that. So I don't even know that the Peabodys themselves had a whole lot of influence on what actually goes in the text, right? I think on getting it published, perhaps, and helping set her up into literary and benevolent networks, right, within the East, but not really, I think, on the sort of content or style of what she does.
That's terrific. Mark, I hate to say this already, but we've already kind of run out of time here. We're at our 1 hour limit. We try to keep it at such. So I'm sorry to say with that, I would like to conclude our program. And Mark, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So until the next time. As a reminder to folks, this talk will be published on the AAS YouTube channel in the coming weeks, so you are welcome to share that. Mark, I can see lots of congratulations and thank yous are coming in through the chat now. I do encourage attendees today to complete the evaluation that's included in the chat and to check out future AAS programs by signing up to our History of the Book mailing list. Our next program is entitled Gems of Art on Paper, American Literary Illustration. This is going to be on Thursday, December 9th at 7 p.m. and features Georgia Barnhill, who is or was the Andrew W. Mellon Curator of Graphic Arts and Director of CHAVIC here at the American Antiquarian Society. We have a great lineup of book talks already scheduled for the spring as well. And we will reconvene on January 27th with Matthew Kirschenbaum, who will share his recently published Bitstreams, The Future of Digital Literary Heritage, pardon me. I'll share the entire lineup in the new year with everyone. In the meantime, I'd like to say thank you for joining us. I wish you all a great end to your semesters if they haven't ended already, and a happy holiday season. So I'll see you next time.